I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. To be frank, when we heard about this meeting on Ukraine being requested by our Western colleagues, there was a fleeting thought in our minds. We thought that the reason for this was the fact that at the start of July, we received a poignant letter from a group of Ukrainian political prisoners addressed to the Security Council President. Let me remind you that it was signed by well-known politicians, human rights defenders, civil servants, and MPs who are today prisoners of the Zelensky regime. For instance, Elena Berezhnaya, Vyacheslav Boguslayev, Vitaly Godina, Artem Dmitruk, Alexander Dubinsky, Oleg Kulinich, Miroslav Oleshko, Alexander Oleynikov, Yuri Rabucha. You all had an opportunity to read that letter and to see for yourself that the number of political prisoners in Ukraine runs into the thousands. Constitutional norms and laws are not being implemented. People are being put behind bars for, and here I quote, calling for peace and the holding of elections, for opposing the war between Slav peoples, for their political and religious convictions, for criticizing the forced mobilization, and for their active civil stance, end of quote. Ukrainian political prisoners are calling on the Security Council to achieve a repeal, and here I quote again, of all illegal sanctions imposed since the start of the war on Ukrainian citizens. For instance, unconstitutional and repressive means of political persecution, end of quote. So it's not just a letter, it's a cri de coeur. Now, back then, we didn't draw the Council's attention to this document to avoid giving our foes a pretext to try and portray all of this as Russian propaganda, as they always do in such cases. Think no further than the fact that in January 2024, Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen, was tormented to death in a security service of Ukraine cell, whose HR revelations were written off as Russian propaganda by the Kiev regime. Starting in 2014, any criticism of the Ukrainian government, according to what they say is Russian propaganda. This unsophisticated logic persists to this day. The forced mobilization, which the human rights defenders mentioned in their letter, is also, according to the Kiev posse, a concoction of the Kremlin. Yet all Ukrainians know that Zelensky's draft officers, the Territorial Centers for Recruitment, or TCRs, well, they're literally abducting people in broad daylight on the streets, in malls, pharmacies, and sports clubs. In doing so, they're using the harshest, at times inhumane methods. Hundreds, if not thousands, of cases have been reported of draftees being killed or maimed. All Ukrainians are talking about this, but the authorities deny it. There's a plethora of videos on social media where men are being nabbed in the streets. They're being ripped from their families, badly beaten, pushed into buses, frequently leaving their small children alone in the street. And Ukrainian civil servants are calling this, cynically calling this, scenes staged by the Moscow film studio. If we believe the Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainians are queuing up to go to the front. Can you imagine what it's like for ordinary Ukrainians to listen to such vile lies? However, recently, this system of collective lying and covering up for each other faltered. Staff at one such draft center in Transcarpathia, during one of their raids, seriously injured a 45-year-old man, József Shibentyev, an ethnic Hungarian who's a citizen of both Ukraine and Hungary. As a result, he ended up in hospital and died after a few weeks. And this despite the fact that Mr. Shebestyen was drafted but then deemed unfit for duty for health reasons. There are hundreds of such cases in Ukraine. They are the norm for the so-called Zelensky concentration camp. That's what Ukrainians are calling their own country. Yet, for our Western colleagues, this topic is taboo. This legal free-for-all is something all European and US human rights defenders aren't talking about. They've been ordered to never speak ill of Ukraine. And this poor soul, Mr. Shebestyen, no one would have found out about his fate. But, unfortunately for Zelensky and his sponsors, he turned out to be a Hungarian. Thus, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hungary protested decisively against the killing of their citizen and demanded official explanations. In response, the Ukrainians said that supposedly the draftee had attempted to flee and then died in hospital of natural causes. Of course, the Ukrainian side, just like in many other cases, despite the obvious facts, refused to bear any responsibility for the man's demise. These lies, of course, did not satisfy Budapest, and the scandal rages on. President, It's a good thing we have Hungary, which takes a principled stance. Hungary does not want to, in contrast to the overwhelming majority of other EU countries, does not want to turn a blind eye to the dictatorship in Ukraine, but who will defend the other unfortunate souls who have been forcibly mobilized. Those who the regime, steeped in lies, led by the Kiev princeling, those who are being thrown into the meat grinder to further Western geopolitical interests. For instance, there's an elderly woman from the city of Myrev in Kharkiv region. Recently, she tried to stop the draft office from taking away her son. She clung on for her life to the minibus full of conscripts, preventing it from leaving. But draft officers pushed her harshly, and as a result, she was unconscious, lying in the middle of the road. Images of this abuse caused outrage across Ukraine. Try to guess what Zelensky's accomplices said in response. You're right, this was all characterized as Russian propaganda. Ukrainians are now used to the fact that getting justice and punishment for all those violating all legal norms, including the Constitution, is impossible. In those rare cases where criminal cases are initiated against draft office staff because they're abusing authority, the State Bureau of Investigations, which conducts pretrial investigations, in that case, that investigations office does not find any crimes. They say no crime has been committed. What are ordinary people left to do? Those who don't want to go and fight. Increasingly, we're seeing them blocking roads, blocking settlements, and not letting draft officers, who they deem cannibals, to enter their towns and cities. Ukrainians absolutely hate staff of these draft officers who are known as politsai in common parlance, the term used for fascist punishers during the occupation of Ukraine. Hate and despair of Ukrainians has reached such a point that they're publishing and sending to the Russians the military coordinates of draft officers and celebrating when we strike them. This is what the former comedian, a self-styled dictator of all Ukraine, has achieved. President, when preparing for today's meeting, we were expecting that Western cheerleaders of Ukraine will at last say that the persecution of canonical Orthodox Christians in Ukraine has reached such a high point. This, given the fact that on the 2nd of July, the Ukrainian president issued a decree stripping the primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Onufry, from stripping him of his Ukrainian citizenship on the basis that he supposedly has Russian citizenship, according to the Security Service of Ukraine, using pseudo-evidence. He denies this, but he's also being accused of, and here I quote, maintaining links with the Moscow Patriarchate and knowingly acting against the canonical independence of the Ukrainian Church from the Moscow Patriarchate, representatives of which are openly supporting the Russian aggression against Ukraine, end of quote. And this is happening in a country where the freedom of religion and the separation of church and state are enshrined in the Constitution. The medieval Inquisition could have learned a lot from the Zelensky regime when it comes to persecuting dissent and witch hunts. As for our Western colleagues, they're averting their eyes in shame when we point out that these are the kinds of authorities they've given rise to in Ukraine. And today they said absolutely nothing, not a word about this outrageous situation I just mentioned. Something else our Western colleagues are silent on is another part of this witch hunt, which the Kiev princeling is engaged in of late. Having found out that anti-corruption structures independent from the president have prepared compromising material and criminal cases against Zelensky and his inner circle, he used his pocket parliament to ensure that this body now reports to the prosecutor general's office, who answers to him, the president. Thus, as we speak, his accomplices are destroying documents exposing corruption in the highest echelons of power, including the Kiev usurper and his team, who've spent billions of dollars in budget funds and Western aid. Now, having gotten their hands on this evidence, the evidence that exposes them, they're now backtracking, supposedly in response to a negative uproar in Ukrainian society and abroad. It's worth noting that the bodies that are being struck, the bodies that are being hit, were initially set up under Western pressure, portrayed as an antidote to corruption. But we didn't hear anything about that today. I cannot but mention the ravaging of the Hill of Glory memorial complex in Lvov. This can only be construed as desecration of the memory of countless victims of fascism who gave their lives fighting against Nazism. Timeless heroic deeds were done by them, by Soviet citizens. To further their short-term interests, the Ukrainian authorities have obscenely exhumed the remains of 355 Soviet warriors, including heroes of the Soviet Union, who fought for the liberation of Lvov from German fascists. Not one of the civilized Western representatives, nor the UN Secretariat, mustered up the courage to condemn these shameful atrocities committed by Ukrainian neo-atrocities. And this despite the fact that every year in the General Assembly we adopt a resolution on combating the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism and other practices that contribute to the fueling of contemporary racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance, emphasizing that it's unacceptable to destroy memorials and monuments commemorating the heroism of those who fought against Nazism in World War II and the illegal exhumation and transfer of their remains. So why did we convene today's meeting if not to discuss these topics I just mentioned? Well, it was convened to artificially maintain the Ukrainian file afloat at the Security Council, especially against the backdrop of the ongoing slaughter and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, on which our Western colleagues are much less eloquent. The meeting is also an opportunity to criticize Russia for methodically and consistently destroying military infrastructure and sites related to Ukraine's military capabilities, blowing up warehouses containing Western-supplied ammunition and equipment, striking areas where Ukrainian soldiers, foreign instructors and mercenaries are gathering. In a word, Russia is doing everything it should, given that a war is being waged against it imposed by NATO countries. Does this ritualistic, propaganda-laden paradigm deserve a Security Council being convened? Don't waste your time. Don't waste ours. We destroyed, are destroying, and will continue to destroy the military infrastructure of the Kiev regime as part of our demilitarization of Ukraine, which is one of the objectives of our special military operation. We do not strike civilian objects. These objects are being affected solely due to the activities of the Ukrainian anti-missile defenses stationed in the residential areas of cities in violation of international humanitarian law norms. Ordinary Ukrainians know this full well. They're afraid not of Russian strikes, but of the actions of their own soldiers. They also know that we're not fighting them, we're fighting against the Kiev regime, which has sacrificed its country, together with all Ukrainians, in the name of the West's anti-Russia project. The more you deliver military supplies to Kiev, the more we will strike. It's not our choice. We've been consistently proposing the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis through diplomacy for a long time now. But you won't agree to that. For now, you're ready to continue fighting Russia using Ukraine's hands, and the fact that there are fewer Ukrainians around does not concern you. That's why you're stubbornly trying not to notice the fact that the regime in Kiev, which is completely corrupt, it's trying to save the skins of Zelensky and his posse, putting the future of Ukraine in question. We will discuss this in detail at a separate meeting we've requested for the 31st of July. At that meeting, we suggest focusing on actions which undermine the search for a diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian conflict, including attempts to thwart direct Russo-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for this statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Pakistan. I thank ASG Miroslav Yencha and ASG Msuya for their briefings. Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the continuing hostilities and devastating consequences of this conflict, particularly